Deep in the Bavarian countryside, 60 kilometers north of Munich, sat a small, isolated farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. On April 4, 1922, the silence of this place was finally broken. When neighbors discovered something that would haunt German criminal history for a century. 6 people, including a 2-year-old boy and a 70-year-old woman, were found slaughtered. The scene was bizarre, the motive was absent, and the details were chilling. As the archivist, I look for the gaps where the official record falters. We are not just looking for a killer today. We are looking for the truth behind the anomaly. But where does a story like this actually begin? Let's stay with what's certain, according to documented police interviews with neighbors. Days before the murders, the patriarch Andreas Gruber began describing events that defied logic. He found a pair of footprints in the fresh snow leading from the forest directly to the farm, but there were no footprints leading back. Then, a newspaper appeared on the porch, a Munich daily that no one in the house had purchased. Gruber also reported hearing footsteps in the attic and finding his house keys missing. What's usually overlooked here is that Gruber actually told several people about these events, yet he never contacted the authorities. Some suggest he was simply a stubborn private man, while others speculate he knew exactly who was stalking him. And this is where it gets interesting. The lock on the tool shed had been tampered with, scratched as if by someone trying to find a specific instrument. Was it a stranger, or someone who knew the layout of the farm by heart? The evidence of a pre-existing intruder is well documented in the Munich police files, yet it only deepens the mystery of why the family stayed. When the search party entered the barn on that Tuesday afternoon, they found a sight that defied the typical patterns of rural crime. 4 of the victims, Andreas, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria, and her daughter Kazilia, were found stacked in the barn, covered with hay and an old door. The youngest, Joseph, and the maid Maria were found inside the house. The official autopsy performed by court physician Johann Baptist Anomaly confirmed that the weapon was a heavy tool, likely a pickaxe or a mattock. The precision of the strikes was surgical. Most victims died from single devastating blows to the head. Let's stay with what's certain. There was no sign of a struggle that would suggest a robbery gone wrong. In fact, Victoria's gold jewelry and significant amounts of cash were left untouched in the house. This leads us to a difficult question. If the motive wasn't money, what was it? The documentation shows that the killer spent a significant amount of time arranging the scene. But why bother covering the bodies if you intended to flee? And this is where it gets truly disturbing. Forensic evidence suggested the murders occurred on Friday night, but the bodies weren't found until Tuesday. In those 4 days, the Hinterkaifeck farm was not empty. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney throughout the weekend. When the police finally arrived, they found that the cattle had been fed, and the cows had been milked. Someone had even eaten a full meal in the kitchen while the 6 inhabitants lay dead just a few meters away. What's usually overlooked here is the sheer psychological profile of such an intruder. This wasn't a panicked flight, it was a domestic takeover. The dog was tied up and cared for. The killer made themselves at home. Let's weigh the possibilities. One theory suggests the killer was simply waiting for the snow to clear or for the heat to die down. However, another perspective, often whispered in the archives, is that the killer felt they had a right to be there. They weren't hiding from the farm, they were occupying it. But who could commit such a brutal act and then calmly proceed to perform the daily chores of their victims? The Munich police were eventually called in, but by the time they arrived, the crime scene had been compromised by dozens of curious locals. Despite this, the investigation was massive. Over the following years, detectives interviewed more than 100 suspects. They looked at vagrants, traveling salesmen, and even local villagers. But the rural code of silence was difficult to crack. What's usually overlooked is the sheer frustration of the lead investigator, Georg Reingruber. He was dealing with a community full of secrets and a crime that felt personal. In a desperate move, The victims' heads were sent to Munich for clairvoyants to examine, a sign of how thin the actual evidence was. Unfortunately, those skulls were lost during the bombings of World War II, taking any modern forensic hope with them. Let's stay with what's certain. The police reports describe a household fraught with internal tension long before the murders. The investigation eventually narrowed down to two primary theories that still divide historians today. So, was the killer a ghost from the past or a neighbor in plain sight? The first major theory centers on a man who was officially dead. Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, was reported killed in the trenches of France in 1914. However, his body was never recovered. In the years following the war, several soldiers claimed to have seen a man matching Karl's description. The theory suggests that Karl didn't die, but instead spent years in a prisoner of war camp or hiding. Upon returning to Hinterkaifeck, he would have found a family dynamic that was, to put it mildly, scandalous. It was widely rumored in the village that Andreas Gruber had fathered Victoria's youngest child, Josef. If Karl Gabriel returned to find his wife living in an incestuous household with his father-in-law, the motive for a brutal, vengeful cleansing of the farm becomes clear. It explains why the killer knew the farm's layout and why they stayed to care for the animals. However, there is a significant gap in this account. No one ever produced a shred of physical evidence that Karl survived the war. Let's weigh this against the facts. Is it more likely that a dead soldier traveled hundreds of miles in secret, or that the killer was much closer to home? The question remains, was this a soldier's revenge or a local's solution? This brings us to Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a local neighbor who had a very complicated history with the Gruber family. Schlittenbauer had been in a relationship with Victoria and was initially named as the father of little Joseph. However, he later accused Andreas Gruber of the same thing. When the search party arrived at the barn, Schlittenbauer did something that raised every red flag in the police handbook. He entered the barn alone and began moving the bodies before the authorities arrived. He claimed he was looking for his son, but many believed he was tampering with evidence. What's usually overlooked is that Schlittenbauer possessed a key to the farm. This would explain the missing keys Andreas reported days before the murders. And this is where it gets interesting. Schlittenbauer lived a long life after the incident, but he was constantly followed by the whispers of the village. He even won several civil lawsuits for slander against those who called him a murderer. Let's stay with what's certain. Schlittenbauer had the motive, the access, and the proximity. But why would he lead the search party to the bodies himself if he were the killer? Was it a calculated move to appear helpful, or the actions of a man genuinely concerned for a child he believed was his? In 2007, the Bavarian Police Academy took a fresh look at the case using modern criminal profiling and forensic techniques. They spent years poring over the original 1922 documents and subsequent interviews. Their conclusion was both fascinating and frustrating. While they were able to rule out many of the early suspects, they ultimately decided the case could never be solved. The passage of time and the loss of the physical evidence, specifically the victims' skulls, made DNA testing impossible. They did, however, identify one primary suspect. But out of respect for the living descendants, they refused to name him publicly. What's usually overlooked in these modern reviews is that they found the stranger in the attic theory highly plausible. It suggests that someone, whether Karl Gabriel, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, or a nameless drifter, was living in that house, observing the family's most intimate secrets for days before striking. Let's stay with what's certain. The Hinterkaifeck anomaly isn't just about who held the pickaxe. It's about the terrifying reality that for one weekend in 1922, a killer and their victims shared the same roof in total silence. So, what do we actually know? We know that footprints led to the house and never left. We know that a family was executed with military precision. And we know that someone stayed behind to milk the cows while the farm was a tomb. The archivist must weigh these facts against the legends. Was it the return of a dead husband, or the breaking point of a vengeful neighbor? The documentation for both is compelling, yet both are riddled with contradictions. The Hinterkaifeck anomaly remains one of history's most stubborn gaps. It is a story of isolation, incest, and a war that never truly ended for some. What's usually overlooked is that the farm itself was demolished a year after the murders. Today, only a small shrine stands in the fields. The physical layers of the crime are gone, leaving only the paperwork and our questions. Perhaps the truth is buried in those lost skulls, or perhaps it's still wandering the woods of Bavaria. The honest question is, if the killer was never caught, where did they go when they finally left the farm? Thank you for joining me in the archives today. History is rarely a closed book. It is a series of layers waiting to be peeled back. If you want to dig deeper into the mysteries that official accounts leave behind, subscribe to Hidden Layer. We will continue to ask the questions that others ignore. Until next time, stay skeptical and keep looking for the truth in the gaps.